What's good, everybody? It's your boy. Welcome back to Big Nate's. Oh, wait, it's your boy, Big Nate. Forgot to include the Big Nate part. Welcome back to Big Nate's Reading Club, home of the best reading clubs. I might be so off my rocker because we got such a dope essay to discuss. Today, we're talking about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which is about a number of things, but I think primarily about how once art is able to be reproduced again mechanically at at scale, essentially this fundamentally changes the nature of art. So we're going to be talking about what's the nature of authenticity in art post mechanical reproduction. What is the role, particularly of things like photography and film as actual art forms, and how did this reproduction of art, how did this fundamentally change art as we know it? So we got a bunch of dope stuff to talk about. I'm very hyped. And yeah, so that's today's book. So as chat goes ahead and streams in, I'm brewing my tea right here. I think I got a little 1 or 2 more minutes until it's fully brewed. But yeah, I'll just let people funnel on in. And as always, let's talk about what Big Nate has been reading. So still, and like it will be for I think many weeks to come, we are going to be talking about I'm currently reading Moby Dick, and of course still the rise and fall of the Third Reich. Moby Dick is still hitting. Again, it's like much more readable than I anticipated. I haven't got to the inevitable parts where it's like, overly describing like the whaling inventory. That's like the notorious like critique of this book, and just over descriptively talking about a bunch of like very niche whaling knowledge. I haven't got to that part yet. So far, it's actually just amazing. We just got introduced to some new characters, the first, second, third, first mates, and their harpooners, all that good stuff. So really enjoying Moby Dick, and I feel like we're going to get a lot of good reflections on, like just being out in the middle of the ocean. We've already got some hints on like the spiritual aspects of whaling, and whaling as this noble profession, and lots of good stuff. So I'm excited to see where that goes. In the meantime, also the rise and fall of the Third Reich. What happened last? Poland has fallen. Poland has officially fallen. And of course, also what's good? Cool Colt. Good to see you. Good to see you. And one of the things that is interesting in the rise and fall of the Third Reich is just, again, even like with Czechoslovakia, Britain and France and Russia all essentially were tied to Czechoslovakia by a treaty. Or by extensions of treaties with treaties. Like, for instance, Britain was tied to France. France was directly tied to Czechoslovakia, blah, blah, blah. Nobody lifted a finger when it came to taking over Czechoslovakia, which put Germany in a much better position. It's like, damn, okay, how did they drop the ball on that? But they did. And then now, after Poland, it fell. And then in the meantime, because now Britain and France were like, okay, Hitler, if you invade Poland, we're for real, no jokes this time. We for real going to come after you. And he invaded Poland, and guess what? Nobody did. Nobody has done a thing. I'm spoiler alert if you're aware of history. This is when Britain and France do come in. But yeah, at this point, Poland completely fell without any aid from France or Britain. And it's just amazing how many times Hitler has pulled a fast one on them, where they keep threatening to do something. Hitler keeps calling their bluff, and they never act. It's actually a bit infuriating to just like watch it go on, country after country, and especially France has been, I think, not been dealing with this in a particularly honorable way. Not that I can, say anything. But anyhow, yeah, so once again, they were able to just get off scotch-free. Poland has fallen. There's been some backdoor kind of shady deals with Stalin and Hitler. And that's kind of what's new with that. But yes, Cool or whoever else is watching, if you are, I'm kind of curious what everybody's reading, but of course no pressure. Let me just stir my little tea here, see what's good. Let's take a little sip, a little trial sip. Why don't we? Is it perfect? Who brewed this? My compliments to the brewer. Happy 4th of July to everybody, too, who is celebrating coming up here. For me, it's Friday, and that is an excellent thing. So, without further ado, why don't we just get right into it? Like I said, we're going to be talking about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which in the last stream, I was like, that kind of sounds boring. The title sounds boring, but trust me, it's dope. And it is super dope. There's lots of ideas to talk about, but I will admit let's just get this out of the way. I did find this text to be a little dry, a little more dry than I remembered. I read it in... Again, it was like a classic for my English lit degree. This is a major piece of like literary criticism just in general. And Walter Benjamin is a very famous, influential literary critic just in the history of literary criticism. But so I'm like, okay, this is gonna be good. I remember generally what it was about, but I started reading it, and like I said, there's some parts that were a little dry, but that's what Big Nate's here for. Call me the translator, because we read this, we're gonna take the gems, we're going to break it down for the audience, and we're going to talk about what I think there's a reason this is a classic essay in the field, and that's because there are some very interesting ideas. So I think without further ado, we can just get right into it. So I did kind of want to read here the, what do you call this? Epigraph, the little quote that gets mentioned in the beginning of a text. And it's by Paul Valéry, who I've seen pop up. I swear it's like Jung who mentions this dude, but I've seen him pop up in several different places. I might have to go straight to the source eventually. But I think this is a nice encapsulation kind of introduction into the basic ideas. So Paul Valéry says, "Our fine arts were developed, their types and uses were established in times very different from the present. The amazing growth of our techniques, the adaptability and precision they have attained, the ideas and habits they are creating, make it a certainty that profound changes are impending in the ancient craft of the beautiful." So just the idea that there's a momentous change taking place, right? In the modern day when he was writing, something fundamentally is shifting the way in which art is produced and received, and just the nature of art in general, right? Profound changes, he says, are impending in the ancient craft of the beautiful. For the last 20 years, neither matter nor space nor time has been what it was from time immemorial. We must expect great innovations to transform the entire technique of the arts, thereby affecting artistic invention itself, and perhaps even bringing about an amazing change in our very notion of art. And basically what's encapsulated there is this ability of technology, and ultimately, as we're going to talk about, mechanical reproduction of art, the way in which this is going to fundamentally change artistic invention itself, and perhaps even bringing about an amazing change in our very notion of art. So again, that's, I think, really laying the groundwork for a lot of like the main ideas that we'll be talking about in this essay. All right, and so just getting started here, Walter Benjamin writes, "In principle, a work of art has always been reproducible. Replicas were made by pupils in practice of their craft, by masters for diffusing their works, and finally by third parties in the pursuit of gain. Mechanical reproduction of a work of art, however, represents something new." And so, this is true. We're talking about the reproducibility of art, right? This is, replicas were made by pupils. That was a common practice back in the day, is if you have like an art... Oh, wait, hold up. Did my thing work? My camera just did something weird. I think I'm still good. I still see myself here. So I think... Let me know if you can't see me, but I'm pretty sure I can be seen. Hold up. Let me just check. Something weird's going on. I think I'm good. I'm gonna say I'm good. Let me know otherwise. But back in the day, you'd have an artistic, okay, kind of laggy overall. Okay, all right, weird. I don't know. Okay, we're just gonna have to roll with it. We're still figuring out. We're still getting the Twitch growing pains. But basically, you have the artistic pupils, and part of their training would be to literally paint replicas of their master's work. And you also, again, the masters would do it to diffuse their works, right? If this was a particularly popular work of art, you can make multiple copies of it. And then you have third parties in the pursuit of gain, which I interpreted just as counterfeit. So there's nothing fundamentally new about this idea of reproducing art. However, mechanical reproduction of a work of art represents something totally new. And so he talks about a little bit almost like about the history of reproduction of art here. The Greeks originally knew only two procedures of technically reproducing works of art. founding and stamping. And then there was the woodcut graphic art, which became mechanically reproducible for the first time. So you have like these pieces of wood in which, I mean, there's different variations of it, but you would carve the patterns into the actual piece of wood, and then you can kind of like stamp it, as he says, right? What was it? Founding and stamping. And during the Middle Ages, engraving and etching were added to the woodcut. At the beginning of the 19th century, lithography made its appearance. And lithography involved the tracing of the design on a stone rather than its incision on a block of wood. It permitted graphic art for the first time to put its products on the market, not only in large numbers as hitherto, but also in daily changing forms. That used to be involved, man. That would take a day. Yeah, exactly. The difference he's talking about here is, physically etching something into like a piece of wood versus, in this case, the kind of early forms of lithography was good, and lighting was good. But the early forms of lithography, you could basically, change it on a day-to-day basis, and it became much more easier, and you could produce things, absolutely en masse. And then lithography, of course, was surpassed by photography. For the first time in the process of pictorial reproduction, photography freed the hand of the most important artistic functions developed only upon the eye looking into a lens. The process of pictorial reproduction was accelerated so enormously that it would eventually was able to keep pace with speech, and then therefore we have film. So it's like, the way I interpreted this, right? For the first time in the process of pictorial reproduction, you don't need skill, you don't need talent, right? All of the most important artistic functions, he says, now devolved only upon the eye looking into a lens. So now to capture a scene, an image, a picture in its entirety, all you have to do is look through a lens and, press a button, versus before photography, and before, these other forms of like lithography and related things, there was a much deeper just art and practice involved into that. But now at the simple click of a button, right, you can just capture a scene, and things which the naked eye ordinarily couldn't catch, otherwise. And this is also interesting because, as I understand it, a lot of like the early forms of art were focused on realism, painting as precise a picture as you possibly could, down to the shading. And, artistic merit in many ways was proportional to the degree of detail that you could capture, in the tiniest little detail and the tiniest shade, just making it as realistic looking as possible. And, we still have that today. People will, post pictures, make pictures which are just, ultra realistic, photorealistic. But that was like a big thing back in the day. But with the invention of the camera, all that whole form of art in itself just sort of disappeared. Not disappeared, but you can see, right? Obviously, this is not only going to do a better job than you could ever do with whatever fine detail and time and hours and years of talent it takes. Now you can just do that. But that's one thing. And also, I think, in many ways, photography fundamentally changed the nature of painting too, right? Now realism is no longer a merit in painting. You have to find new ways to push that and come up with, and I'm not saying this is exactly it, but maybe I think this could involve or certain sort of unconventional techniques like like impressionism and cubism and surrealism, right? These are things the photograph cannot actually do, right? So painting had to find new ways to essentially become relevant. First time chat, Bard Sonic, the work of art fixed in time and space versus ephemeral. Yes, exactly. And we're gonna dig deeper into that idea as we go on. But also welcome Bard Sonic as a first time chatter. And then we're gonna talk too, as he says, at some point the process of pictorial reproduction became fast enough that it actually gave rise inevitably to film, right? You could capture, pictures and movements like this at a fine enough grain that it could, keep pace with sound. And then now all of a sudden you have movies, you have film. Cool Colt says, I think I heard at one point, at the time of the first cameras, it was extremely controversial to capture a scene so simply. Yeah, exactly. So, And then, so I love this again. So Paul Valery here is giving a quote: "Just as water, gas, and electricity are brought into our homes from far off to satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort, so we shall be supplied with visual or auditory images which will appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign." And this is something, it's I think valuable to read these kinds of things, because something like, photography and film, I personally just totally take for granted. And, I can have maybe an idle sort of thought like, oh man, imagine what it was like, before photographs or before film. But, to hear at this period of time, it really is so fundamental. All of human history at that point, you can't just reproduce a picture. You can't just instantly capture a scene. To capture any kind of scene like that, it would involve, the whole art of essentially painting. Really, I feel like was the only way of reproducing an image out in the real world. And the degree to which you could make it more realistic, the more artistic merit it had. Not to mention something like film, the idea that you could have put these things together in a total sequence and, attach also, auditory aspects to it. You could see how that would, before that existed, would fundamentally change, art. So you could absolutely see that. Cool Colt says facts. That perspective is so important, even having running water. Yeah, I know, exactly. Like, I think that's really what does it for me, is like that comparison is like, just as now, because, at that point they did have this instant access to water, gas, electricity, which prior to that was deemed impossible, had never been done. But now that they have it, and so they're making this analogy in terms of art, right? In terms of photography and film, and the way, it's just, I think with something like social media, even, it's that same principle exemplified, right? He's talking about, oh, this is going to be huge, right? They can satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort. So shall we be supplied with visual or auditory images, just think social media, which will appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand. So, and I think that ubiquitousness and that accessibility, this is why you're waiting in line for 2 minutes and they've already got, their phone out at the quick, simple movement of the hand, literally he says, shall be supplied with visual or auditory images. So very prescient, I think, image. And again, you can see how something like this instant access to photos and film and everything like that would change the actual nature of the art itself. So, sip break, you already know. Okay, so this is where kind of getting to what Bard Sonic was saying, I think, is this idea of aura, this idea of a singularity that is associated with a piece of art. So just going on here. Even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element: its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. This unique existence of the work of art determined the history to which it was subject throughout the time of its existence. And so this, no matter how good, as he says, a reproduction of work actually is, if you have, the Mona Lisa, for instance, and then you have a perfect copy of the Mona Lisa, there's still always going to be a difference. At the very least, it cannot occupy the exact same area of space and time, right? We are getting this element of what makes this piece of art singular. Even if physically down to the arrangement of atoms, it was precisely identical, it will never be this precise piece of art. And this is again where he gets to this idea of aura. I don't know exactly where he gets to this, but I wanted to bring up just an example that came to me the other day, which is that, I was wearing a shirt, right? And it was like my grandpa's shirt, my late grandpa, as they would say. And it occurred to me, it's like the reason I keep this shirt and the reason I like this shirt is because, it belonged to my grandpa. It has a personal history, right? You could give me that exact same shirt and it would be totally meaningless for me, right? It didn't occupy that same history of time and space. It sort of loses that sentimental value. It loses that aura, and I'm using that term technically here in the way that Walter Benjamin describes it, that singular nature of whatever that piece of art is. But I thought that was like an interesting, it'd be totally pointless. And, even if you put, because I got stains on it, it's cut up. I mean, you could give me that exact same thing, and it can, it's not the same, right? There's clearly this distinction, and I would say it's not the same because it's not authentic. And this is where we get this, as he says, the idea of authenticity could not have even existed before the age of reproduction. So he says, the presence of the original is the prerequisite to the concept of authenticity. Mechanical reproduction may not touch the actual work of art, yet the quality of its presence is always depreciated. And so then we get into this idea of, and this we see in modern days, the idea that something needs to be like the authentic original piece, right? You could have, again, something that, especially in modern technology, you could recreate the Mona Lisa or any other piece of art to for all intents and purposes, an exact degree. But it's always going to miss that one aspect, right? That singular aspect, that it's the real authentic thing. And I'm trying to think, like, is there a analogy? Like, how people will go out of their way to buy like crazy things that like a celebrity has touched, for instance, just like a totally common, like a tissue or like a piece of paper that literally just, the only thing that's distinctive about it is that some celebrity, some famous person interacted with it, right? And, you could have, there's a million other tissues, there's a million other pieces of paper, but the idea that this is the authentic one insofar as it has that sort of almost sentimental position, again, in space and time, if this is making any sense. But I think we're understand the idea of what makes some, this allure of something being authentic. There is something to the idea of aura, the idea of that it is a true, singular, original piece of art. It's not a reproduction. As he says, mechanical reproduction may not touch the actual work of art, yet the quality of its presence is always depreciated. So it's almost like the more and more copies are churned out in proportion, we sort of lose, at least in some sense, the original value of it. Sacred versus profane, I think, can come into play too. Yeah, exactly. I feel like the sacred being like the original authentic thing, and the profane aspect, you are doing a sort of profanity in some sense when you do replicate over and over a certain thing that is by its very nature valued because it is so singular. And I was going to talk about this later, but there's a song called Misery May, something like that. It's like this gospel, like, what is it? Like, I think like Catholic church, I don't know. But it's like, the very choral, like, oh, la, 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 la. Beautiful. But anyway, the reason I'm bringing that up is because there's like this story. I actually read it in Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, which I'll do a little video on that at some time. But like from this book, the story goes that it was a composition of music that was meant only for, I forget exactly, but I'm just gonna say the Pope. I think it was the Pope. It was only for his ears, right? But at some point, it was, again, I forget. It was either Mozart or Beethoven. I think it was Mozart. Hears this, and he's exposed to it, and just because of his like genius brain was able to memorize each individual note and so perfectly reproduce this work of art that he was able to recreate it. And so there's two aspects of this. Like, one, it's like there is some, like you said, cool, with the sacred versus profane. It's almost like the sacredness of that piece of music was the fact that it was hidden. It was secret. It was, it was exclusive. Only the Pope had access to this. But once Mozart or Beethoven, like I forget exactly who it was, but once they reproduce it, it sort of loses that, right? That was sort of a profanity of the original piece of art. Yeah, okay, cool, Mozart. Although it's funny, just as a little side note there, apparently he did such a good job of reproducing it that the church was like, all right, that's cool, it's fine. And I think that case is interesting because I personally love that song. Like, honestly, I have very mixed opinions about that book, Martyr, but I will be forever grateful to it for putting me onto that song. And I'm sure, I don't know if the average person listening to this will enjoy it, but I actually find something deeply moving and beautiful about it. And, the idea that this only would have been performed, once a year or whatever it was in this very exclusive room just to the Pope, you could see how that sort of elevates its artistic value in some sense because it's not accessible to the public. So I don't know. That's just, again, this idea of authenticity and the way in which reproduction already kind of, as he says, can depreciate the original piece of art by virtue of the fact of how accessible it is. Bard Sonic says, very good example using your grandfather's sweater. I purchased a small painting from an online artist some time ago. Receiving it through the mail, opening it, then hanging it out on my wall is a unique experience, exactly, versus viewing the image of the artwork he sent me prior to mailing it to me. And now I can appreciate it much more. Exactly. And you could show me that picture. I could look up whatever picture it is you're talking about. I could look it up online and look at the image of it. But yes, exactly. Now you have some element of almost, personal connection to it. Right. And as he says, oftentimes it says this includes, right, when we're talking about the aura of a piece of art, this includes the changes which it may have suffered in physical condition over the years, as well as the various changes in ownership. Again, it's the history of the piece of art. Your piece of art, Bard Sonic, is singular because it is that specific piece of art that came to you and you were able to hang it up on the wall, and it's now has a totally different value than some otherwise, totally equivalent, visually. You could have the identical piece of art, but it's not this piece of art. And in fact, I might be anticipating myself here, getting ahead of myself, but there's this idea of hexaity and quiddity, which are Latin terms for hexaity is thisness, whereas quiddity is whatness. And I think this is a good example because it's like, for instance, Bard Sonic, your individual painting, right? It has a thisness, it has a hexaity, an individuality, whereas the art itself in some sort of almost like abstract form has its whatness, right? There is like the physical configuration of whatever the art is, which can be reproduced a million different times. You can look it up online, you can print it, right? There's 100 ways you can reproduce this. And those are all kind of individual instances of the whatness, the quiddity of whatever that piece of art is. But to each of those reproductions, there is again a hexaity, a thisness. So, all, again, very interesting ideas, kind of like, floating around here, getting into the nature of, it's interesting, right? You wouldn't have thought, you could see how, like, the idea of reproduction of art, it's like, okay, yeah, we just take that for granted. But once the possibility, especially of widespread mainstream mass production of reproduction of art, you can see how this really does change the way in which society interacts with art. All right, so let's go on here. After a sip break, of course. Okay, so kind of alluding to what I've been talking about, one might subsume the eliminated element, the element that's eliminated through reproduction, that is. One might subsume the eliminated element in the term aura and go on to say, that which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of a work of art. And I like that sort of sentence definition of it, right? The degree in proportion to which there are more and more and more reproductions made, in equal degree, we lose the aura of whatever, of the original piece of art it was. The technique of reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition. By making many reproductions, it substitutes a plurality of copies for a unique existence. And I think that's key too. And he's something he's going to explore and develop throughout this essay is the idea that art oftentimes in its very original forms was involved in some kind of spiritual tradition. Even in its original days, Walter Benjamin will say, it's associated with, a magical tradition. And so that's in the individuality and authenticity, singularity of it was part and parcel of what made this ingrained in the tradition. But again, by making reproductions, it substitutes a plurality of copies for a unique existence, and it detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition, right? If I print the Mona Lisa, for instance, it's completely detaching it from its original trajectory, where before a reproduction existed, I would have to travel to France to physically see at the Louvre. I'd have to go and physically visit it. But by being able to just look it up online, I could pull it up on my phone, right? Totally detaches the object from the tradition in which it was brought up in the first place. I think that's going to have important implications, right? The separation, that detachment from tradition is going to have important implications. In permitting the reproduction to meet the beholder or listener in his own particular situation, it reactivates the object reproduced. And and again, this is a tremendous shattering of tradition, as he says. I think in many ways the circumstance in which you were originally to interact with a piece of art, that circumstance is actually part of the art, part of the aura itself, right? Again, normally I would only be able to see the Mona Lisa if I went here, looked there. It applies to any kind of piece of art, but this completely removes that sort of circumstantial element. So let's see here. Oh yeah, so he's kind of again elaborating on most of what we've been talking about. He just kind of elaborating on the idea of the aura. If while resting on a summer afternoon you follow with your eyes a mountain range on the horizon or a branch which casts its shadow over you, you experience the aura of those mountains and of that branch. The uniqueness of a work of art is inseparable from its being embedded in the fabric of tradition. So again, we're kind of like talking about, I'm just elaborating what we were just discussing. And he gives an example. An ancient statue of Venus, for example, stood in a different traditional context with the Greeks, who made it an object of veneration, than with the clerics of the Middle Ages, who viewed it as an ominous idol. Both of them, however, were equally confronted with its uniqueness, that is, its aura. And again, just the idea that art emerges ingrained within a certain tradition. So in the Greek tradition, again, a statue of Venus was an object of holy veneration. In the different tradition of the Middle Ages, they view the same statue as an ominous idol, right? So you can't interpret the piece of art without it being in the larger context of whatever tradition happens to be in. So, in the Middle Ages and in ancient Greece, they had different reactions to it. But again, as Walter Benjamin says, both of them were equally confronted with its uniqueness, its aura, right? That statue of Venus is that's the only version of it. Originally, the contextual integration of art and tradition found its expression in the cult. We know that the earliest artworks originated in the service of a ritual, first the magical, then the religious, and the unique value of the authentic work of art has its basis in ritual. So again, and when he says cult here in the expression of the cult and ritual, to me this is just different words for the idea of spirituality, right? The origin of art, especially in the original days. Well, he says first it was magical, and we'll talk about that more as the essay goes on, and then it was religious. But in all of these, right, art is a product of some kind of spiritual practice. And then again, you can see how once we detach it from that original tradition, it completely loses its value. All right, there's no more of the kind of spiritual element necessarily. I mean, we can discuss this because there's some things in this essay I don't necessarily agree with, because in some way each reproduction of the piece of art still does have its own sort of aura. So like so for instance, Bard Sonic, what you said, where you got a piece of art. In many ways, that piece of art, what you ordered online, is just a reproduction, right? That is one of the sort of detached things from the original work of art in itself, this, that, and the other. But like you said, it begins to take on its own sort of aura. And I think this is an argument, a sort of objection against some of the ideas, at least, of Walter Benjamin here. But even though your copy of the piece of art is a reproduction, it still takes on its own life history and aura and sentimental value, such that it could be a case, for instance, that if you had a special enough relationship with a reproduction, it could be that like your copy of the Mona Lisa, you have so much spiritual connection with it, you'd prefer that one over the original. I mean, I don't think anyone would ever do that, but like if we take a less famous example of the Mona Lisa, you actually could develop a personal relationship with whatever the reproduction is that you would actually value over whatever the original authentic is. So that's kind of like almost a little bit of a counter argument to Benjamin here. But anyway, moving on. So for the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical. Well, I struggle with that word. Let me see Bart's on a very good point. Well, it's just like presence versus recollection. They both have a present moment, but one is tainted. Yeah, love that. Okay, let me try. Let me try this again. For the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. Right? Whenever you normally encounter a piece of art, it had to be in a museum, or even better yet, like, if the original sort of from the painter themselves, or there's even, we'll talk about this, like the most original forms of art are some things like cave art, which oftentimes were meant to be completely hidden, right? It was supposed to be that so that nobody actually saw it, right? And that's where it got so much of its value. We're able to remove that dependence on ritual and completely, right? I don't have to do any of that. I can just look up a picture online. I have no context for it. I have no relation to the circumstances that brought it about, the place, the time. None of that's relevant to me. Totally detach it and just am able to just pull up a picture on my phone, right? It removes, emancipates the dependence on ritual. The work of art reproduced becomes the work of art designed for reproducibility. From a photographic negative, for example, one can make any number of prints. To ask for the authentic print makes no sense. But the instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, politics. So, yeah, a lot to break down. I mean, one line that stood out to me here: the work of art reproduced becomes the work of art designed for reproducibility. So the way I interpreted that is it's almost like once mechanical, widespread, scaling reproduction becomes possible, well, now all of a sudden you're making art with that in mind, right? You're designing your work of art within the context, knowing that it can be widely produced. Again, the work of art reproduced becomes the work of art designed for reproducibility. You're now designing art around this concept of reproducibility, which before never existed. And then again, with the photographic negative, there is no such thing as an authentic print. But the instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production. So the moment this authentic aura, that singular aspect of art, the second that that's no longer relevant, the total function of art is being reversed. It's not based on ritual, but is based on another practice, politics, which we will continue to kind of break down throughout the essay. But again, like I said, lots of really good stuff here, and we're seeing how, building on that original theme of the art of reproduction. So actually, it reminds me of the concept by what's his name, Marshall McLuhan. Wow, I'm surprised I pulled that out there. The medium is the message. And what that idea is, it's like, anytime there's sort of like a new, almost like, mode of technology, anytime there is a development in that sense, it doesn't matter, right? So like, to take an example, like the invention of social media, right? The individual message of each social media post and the things that they talk about, that's not relevant. The thing that's important is the fact of social media itself. The medium is itself the message. And once something like reproduction, right, mechanical reproduction takes place, well, now that in itself fundamentally changes the way in which, we deal with content in the first place. Cool Colt says, this makes me think you can't mass produce a unique thing or something custom. Yeah, exactly. And I think that kind of stuff gets its value from the fact that it is unique and it is custom. Like whenever you get a custom or a limited edition kind of product, it instantly, soars in value. When there's a fancy watch or a fancy car, which they've only made 10 of in the whole world, despite the actual specs of the car and anything about the car itself, the sheer fact of its exclusivity, the authenticity, or the fact that it's limited, that is what makes its value so important. And I think that's what's good. Like you said, you can't mass produce a unique thing or something custom. So let's see here. Okay, yeah, and then again, almost just getting into the history of this kind of stuff. Artistic production begins with ceremonial objects destined to serve in a cult. And when he says cult, I think he just means the magical, mystical, spiritual kind of traditions of old. That's what I don't think it's the idea of cult nowadays where you're in a cult and you get brainwashed and stuff like that. So just clarifying that. But the elk portrayed by the man of the Stone Age on the walls of his cave was an instrument of magic. In the original days, art formed a sort of magical function. This is at least according to Walter Benjamin. But when you, like, I know this was a practice, is before a hunt, for instance, you would go and paint a bunch of different elk or, you know, whatever animal it is you were hunting. And part of that is supposed to be a ritualistic, magical process to help you out once the hunt actually takes place. So again, the elk portrayed by the man of the Stone Age on the walls of his cave was an instrument of magic. The cult value would seem to demand that the work of art remain hidden. Certain statues of gods are accessible only to the priest. Certain Madonnas remain covered nearly all year round. Certain sculptures on medieval cathedrals are invisible to the spectator on the ground level. And this is also related to the Misery May, that story, or that song that I was talking about. It was by definition not allowed to be heard by public ears. It was only supposed to be heard by specifically the Pope, whatever it was, once a year. So in all these cases with these statues and the Madonnas and these sculptures and the portrayal of the elk, all of these would seem to demand that the work of art remain hidden. And that's where, I forget who said it, but the sacredness versus the profaneness of an object, that's, I think, directly related to this. For instance, when the Stone Age man draws a picture of an elk that's supposed to remain hidden for this magical purpose in the cave, you could imagine that if, you know, hey, everybody come in here, and you shine a light on it and you just show it to everybody, or, you know, you take a picture and reproduce infinitely that image that was taken, it completely loses magic, right? It has been profaned. That sacred magical ritual object has been profaned. And you can imagine that to maybe a lesser degree with just art in general. All art, when it's able to be reproduced, loses some of that magical auraistic sort of value that it had to it. It is easier to exhibit a portrait bust that can be sent here and there than to exhibit the statue of a divinity that has its fixed place in the interior of a temple. The same holds for painting as against the mosaic and the fresco that preceded it. And the way I thought about that too is it's just like, once reproduction becomes a possible thing, again, you sort of tailor and design your art towards that. A portrait bust, it's much easier to exhibit a portrait bust that can be sent here and there than to exhibit the statue of a divinity fixed in its place. Same thing with paintings, right? Paintings might become more popular because they are much more reproducible or can be sent here and there versus something like a mosaic or fresco, which is rooted in its place. So, and again, going on here, he says, fitness for exhibition increased to such an extent that the quantitative shift between the two poles being like sort of like this ritual value and then this like reproduction value. Its fitness for exhibition increased to such an extent that the quantitative shift between its two poles turned into a qualitative transformation of its nature. This is comparable to the situation of the work of art in prehistoric times, when it was first and foremost an instrument of magic. Only later did it become to be recognized as a work of art. By the absolute emphasis on its exhibition value, the work of art becomes a creation with entirely new functions. Again, this is kind of what we've been talking about this whole time, but I like this phrase here. It turns into a qualitative transformation into nature. Of its nature. The instant reproducibility becomes a thing. It qualitatively changes the nature of art itself. Perhaps in a way, he says analogously, where, you know, in its original form, art was not considered to be art. It was a sort of magical symbol ritual, right? That was its function. But the second it's only later that it's recognized as a work of art. The emphasis on its exhibition becomes a creation with entirely new functions, right? So the way in which we're able to interact with it changes the nature of the object itself. All right, moving on. In photography, exhibition value begins to displace cult value all along the line, but cult value does not give way without resistance. And this is a little bit of a tangent here, but, you know, he's saying for something like photography completely removes the cult value, and now it's all about reproduction, commodity, mass production, stuff like that. But, you know, sort of as a little counterpoint in his own argument here, cult value does not give way without resistance, and he gives an example of a certain type of photograph. It is no accident that the portrait was the focal point of early photography. The cult of remembrance of loved ones, absent or dead, offers a last refuge for the cult value of the picture. For the last time, the aura emanates from the early photographs and constitutes their melancholy, incomparable beauty. So again, the way I interpreted that is it's like, even with photographs, which are all about, just as at a high level here, being able to instantly sort of capture an image and reproduce it as many times as you want, there is still a sort of cult element that retains within it. And again, this is true of the portrait. And I think a lot of us can relate to this. If you have, like, you know, a deceased loved one, there is something about just a picture that really, you know, pulls at your heartstrings. And I think it's because he says here, the cult of the remembrance of the loved one. It is the last time, for the last time, the aura emanates from the early photographs. And it's like, in a way, and I think truly good photography captures an instant, right? An instant moment, a thisness, a hexaity, which in itself has its own cult value, right? You're capturing an art, and I think this is what makes photography genuinely artistic, right? If you're just using it like to take pictures from a purely sort of utilitarian view, like just to, you know, record something, right? You're not adding any kind of aesthetic element. You're just sort of taking a picture in the terms of, like, you know, physically recording it. Versus if you capture, like, you know, the expression. I mean, for instance, I just watched this documentary on the Vietnam War, and some of the photographs there are just absolutely haunting. And it's because it captures a specific moment in time, and because of that, right, it's never coming back. That moment itself can never be reproduced. Therefore, it has a sort of cult value. It has a sort of aura. And even though photographs can be reproduced sort of endlessly, there is something about the photograph capturing that moment of thisness, which can never, like I said, be reproduced. So Cool Colt says, I heard about this cave in which the entrance was small and you had to crawl quite a distance before it opened up. Once it opened up, it was found that there was a ton of elaborate cave art, and despite the grueling distance to get there, not to mention carrying material to make light, despite this, there was a ton of spiritually significant art, perhaps never viewed by its creators because of the lack of light. Yeah, exactly. I think that was a better description of what I was kind of, or a more in-depth one than what I was talking about. You can have these places that were just not meant to be seen, right? Like you said, you have to crawl a whole distance. It's very laborious, right? The person themselves might not have even seen the art, and yet the cave is full of these, you know, spiritual pieces of art, these symbols. And I think that's exactly it. That's where it derives its cult value. That's where it gets its aura. And, you know, that's just a limit kit, right? Because, you know, aura kind of applies to everything, but that's just a very extreme case where it's like, this is a singular piece of art here, right? And it becomes profaned once other people lay eyes on it. Like I said, if you brought a team of explorers in to come, they excavate the site, they remove the piece of art, they take extensive pictures of it, and, you know, reproduce it, send it out online. It's totally lost its cult value. At least it's in its original intention. And like Walter Benjamin says, it has been detached. It has been removed from the original tradition in which it was created, and therefore loses its aura. This is just the kind of thing that happens once mechanical reproduction exists, right? It's a fundamentally different thing. There's a shift, a qualitative shift, as he says, once something like that takes place. So, let's see here. Oh yeah, and then again with the photographs, that's where we were just leaving it. So even within photography, and I would say by that case also film, you can still have thisness, so to speak, the aura. Ark of the Covenant in Indiana Jones. I watched that actually not too long ago. Can you elaborate on that? What? Because you're not supposed to lay eyes on it, right? You open it, and it's like if you lay eyes on it, you die. I think that's it. But yeah, I mean, I see where you're going there. You could follow up in the comments if you want. But yeah. Okay, so moving on here. So earlier, in its original sort of conception, much futile thought. Hold up, let's see. I feel that that is a common movie theme, uncovering something old and powerful aura and it being incredibly dangerous or otherwise significant. Yeah, I agree. Exactly. And it does have to do with, like the laying eyes on it. Like in many ways, I mean, okay, this is like a bit of a stretch, but in the cases that we're talking about now, where it's like, it's literally only seen by one person, or maybe it's not even being seen by a person at all, or you're not meant to lay eyes on it. You're uncovering something old and powerful, like you said. It's almost like in that case, and this is a very extreme, and I'm getting a little abstract here, but it's almost like literally just the witnessing of it is a sort of reproduction in perception, right? Like if I see something that I was not meant to be seen, it loses some of its value because it has been reproduced. I'm able to actually physically perceive it in some sense. And it could be like as the movie trope once that happens, that again, I whoever brought it up, I forget what it was, but that's a great term to bring up. There's a sort of profanity that takes place when that happens, and then therefore the old and powerful thing becomes angry, and there's some kind of danger, consequences associated with it. That was something that was not meant to be reproduced, even if only just in visual perception. So yes, great. Glad you brought that up. So earlier, back in the day, when it was first originated, much futile thought had been devoted to the question of whether photography is an art. The primary question, whether the very invention of photography had not transformed the entire nature of art, was not raised. So once this first happened, everybody was sort of debating, oh, is photography an art? Like, just as we're talking about, it doesn't require any talent. Like, you can just take a picture of something and it captures it instantly, right? There's no sort of artistic merit to it necessarily. I mean, we've talked about the ways in which photography can become artistic, but especially in its original formation, right? It's not doing anything artistic. It's simply taking a snapshot. It's reporting the information in many ways very objectively. Right, so they're saying, back in the day they were debating, is this an art? Is this not an art? All right, whatever. But as Walter Benjamin says, the real question here is whether the very invention of photography had not transformed the entire nature of art. Right, I think that's a good encapsulation of what I was talking about. The medium is the message, right? It's not about is photography an art. The overlying thing here, the important thing to take note of, the truly significant act is the fact that photography is changing art itself, right? The medium is the message. It has fundamentally changed the way in which art is, before photography and after photography. And we can even make just a more general claim: before reproduction, mechanical reproduction, and after mechanical reproduction. In spiritual paths, Cool Cult says, it is common that a student is unprepared for certain teaching or images and ideas. Yeah, exactly. And again, maybe they haven't worked up what was necessary to be able to confront that, sort of unique aura. And I know, like, with the words aura and like spirituality, we're getting a little mumbo jumbo, but I think, in the context of how we've been talking about it, I think we can see how that, makes sense and has genuine validity to it. So, let's see. Let me take a sip break and just reorient. Yeah, I think this next part is really interesting. I think specifically he's talking about the difference between stage acting, that is to say, like actual theatrical productions that are put on, versus something like the film. And we're going to do a bit of a dissection here into the differences, kind of like how we've been doing with the differences with photography and painting, right? The fundamental nature of those things. So too is this, or their analogy between the stage play and the film. So let's see what Walter Benjamin has to say. After I read Cool Cult's message here, we kind of totally overlook the power of things, especially in our society, because it has lost so much power and has been profaned. This is actually super relevant. Yeah, exactly. Like the hyper commodification of everything makes us totally devalue and take for granted. I mean, even like whoever mentioned it earlier with the Paul Valéry quote, with the having access to electricity and water and stuff, that kind of stuff was, before it was so easily accessible, had a totally kind of different value to it. And once it does become so reproducible, it loses a lot of its value. We take it for granted. And that's just true of all things in society. Like you said, the power of things right now. Okay, weird. I don't know why that keeps happening, but whatever. But yeah, no, I agree. Super, super relevant. And I think a lot of the things that Walter Benjamin talks about has just been even more sort of emphasized, become more and more concentrated. These ideas of like, massive reproduction. I mean, because he starts talking about art as a commodity and just the idea of a commodity. I mean, I live in America, which of course is a like hyper capitalistic society where it's just all about reproducing things at a massive, massive scale. Everything needs to be able to be reproduced. And again, which gives so much more emphasis and value to when something is truly unique. So, okay, let's see. Going on here. The artistic performance of a stage actor presented to the public by the actor in person. Wait, hold up. Oh, okay, yeah, my bad. The artistic performance of a stage actor is definitely presented to the public by the actor in person. That of the screen actor, however, is presented by a camera. The camera need not respect the performance as an integral whole. The camera continually changes its position with respect to the performance. The sequence of positional views which the editor composes from the material supplied him constitutes the completed film. So let's just break that down a little bit. In an actual sort of artistic stage performance, right, the presentation, the story, the actual act itself is presented from the actor directly to the person. Whereas something like a screen with film, there's this total intermediary of the camera, right? The camera you can zoom in, it can go slow motion, you can move it here, you can move it there. Cut, you can make a bunch of different scenes. That's kind of what he's saying here. That was not available to the original stage performance, right? Everybody is, there's a direct face-to-face element of the audience and the performers. And there's no shifting of positions. There's no, slow motion special effects, right? It's just like that raw confrontation of performer and audience. Whereas something like film is, totally just chops it up, as he says. The sequence of positional views which the editor composes from the material supplied him constitutes the completed film, right? You just get a bunch of footage, you cut it, you try this scene one day, you try another scene. It's totally fragmented as opposed to something like, an actual stage performance. So let's see here. An interesting photographer to check out is Jeff Wall. Bard Sonic, let me ask you, why is Jeff Wall interesting? Because I'm just curious about what it is, because obviously photography is an art form. Like if you're just sort of taking pictures, like a surveyor, a land surveyor, a government employee that's just supposed to sort of clinically take pictures, right? Simply as a recording of information. I think a lot of us would say that's not art, but obviously there is a form of photography in which it actually can take artistic value, and that's why I'm asking Bart Sonic, what is it about Jeff Wall that like you just like about the photographs? Not to put you on the spot, but just while we're having the conversation. And Wall, he's a street photographer. Maybe I'll wait 2 seconds and just orient while people respond. And in fact, here, you know what? Let me just look it up. Wall. You guys won't be able to see me. Let's look up Jeff Wall photography. Yeah, and okay, so like whoever said, I think it was Enlightened, just the idea of the street photography. But yeah, it's this is, I think, from at least what I'm looking at here, it's capturing these specific moments, right? And there's like so much actually kind of individually going on, like just from like what I'm looking at. There's different expressions, people doing different things, and that's what's unique about photography is it captures that actual instant. Oh. Man, hold up. You telling me he organizes and stages his images. Okay, so was I just totally spouting nonsense? Bullshit, as we would say. Because it sounds like it's actually almost like this, and the way in which he's talking about with film, where it's very sort of like contrived. And like you have like, you be in this, but you go here. This prop needs to be in this specific position, right? It's very artificial in some sense, the way in which he's describing film here. And so here, I'll just go on here. The film actor lacks the opportunity of the stage actor to adjust to the audience during his performance. This permits the audience to take the position of a critic without experiencing any personal contact with the actor. The audience's identification with the actor is really an identification with the camera, and this is ordinarily not the approach to which cult values may be exposed. So again, the film actor here lacks the opportunity of the stage actor to adjust to his audience during his performance. Like I'm sure, even something like stand up comedy, or like, again, an actual stage production, you read the room, right? Like, people, you might get a particularly good reaction out of this, which might lead you to give some kind of impromptu, even, kind of like little scene or little line or something like that, right? You can read the audience directly because you are face to face with them. There is a direct connection there. Whereas, again, here, the audience's identification in film with the actor is really an identification with the camera. And the film actor, in fact, here, it might even be on this next page here, but, there's no interaction with the film actor with an actual individual, with an actual audience. And this is why I think there's something like a big difference between something like Broadway, and which is like, of course, like the stage production, actual films. And oftentimes it's sort of remarked that, like, stage actors aren't necessarily the best, or not stage actors, film actors aren't necessarily the best Broadway actors, because they're not used to giving a coherent, unified sort of performance. And they don't have that skill of being able to gauge the audience, or even just, again, perform anything in this non-fragmented way. Let's see here. Yes, okay, so in film, for the first time, man has to operate with his whole living person, yet foregoing its aura. For aura is tied to his presence. There can be no replica of it. The aura which on the stage emanates from Macbeth cannot be separated from the spectators from that cannot be separated for the spectators from that actor. With film, the camera is substituted for the public. Consequently, the aura that envelops the actor vanishes, and with it the aura of the figure he portrays. And I think this is interesting. When recently I was in New York, and my girl convinced us to go to a Broadway show, and I remember I had this thought where it's like, they're giving this play, right? They've rehearsed this play hundreds of times, and they're giving it out. They're doing individual performances dozens and dozens of times, and presumably at its heart, it's like the same play, but it's never going to be, again, like this individual instance, right? It's almost like with the idea of the original and the counterfeit sort of painting. You can have a truly perfect replica in terms of like how the actual image is organized, but it's never going to be this actual image. And same thing with like, a Broadway play. There is never going to be another exact performance like this. If anything, just by virtue of, like we've been saying, its position in time and space. So, again, the aura is tied to his presence, like the stage actor. The aura which on the stage emanates from Macbeth cannot be separated from the spectators from that actor. Whereas, again, something like film, there's no spectators at all. I mean, I can see an argument for, even in film, like when you're, doing like, these different scenes and, the camera, there could still be like a sort of aura, but you understand how like there's a fundamental difference here between. Because I think, integral to the art of stage performance is the fact that there is an audience. So you can see how these are fundamentally different things, right? A film is not in any way obviously in some ways, but it's not in any way in terms of like aura comparable to a stage play. Fundamentally different things. Let's see. Oh yeah, this was another little interesting part. So again, we're kind of talking about the same idea, the differences. And I think part of this, I wanted to say, part of Walter Benjamin's views on film here, I think might be influenced by the fact that this is film in its very early days. Like I think they had just kind of like incorporated sound. I'm not exactly sure, but I mean, whatever it is, it's definitely early relative to where we are today. And I think film has taken on a new sort of, has really embraced the sort of artistic medium that it can actually that's unique to film itself. But, like David Foster Wallace says at some point, when he talks about like TV at that point was like very generic, very just like pure entertainment. There was no, according to David Foster Wallace, I think by and large, real artistic value in television. Whereas now, today, I think some of the greatest works of art are TV shows. So anyway, just keeping all that in mind when he says this, right? In the film, the greatest effects are almost always obtained by acting as little as possible. In film, the actor is treated as a stage prop, inserted at the proper place. The stage actor identifies himself with the character of his role. The film actor, very often, is denied this opportunity. His creation is by no means all of a piece. It is composed of many separate performances. So here, let me read what Cool Colt just said, and then I'll break that passage down. I feel like when new mediums are introduced, it is very healthy to heavily scrutinize them, but critiques from those times will surely have a bit of bias as you point them out. Yeah, exactly. And then oftentimes, it's through the scrutinizing of them, the criticism of that you can actually identify, what it is that can be unique about a certain thing. Film, or let's just say TV shows, for instance, they were sort of criticized in this way for just sort of being like mindless entertainment. But once you kind of identify that, then you can have a new vantage point from which you can explore. So, okay, how can we make this a genuinely aesthetic sort of art? Same thing with photography. I think the big reaction to photography is this is not art, right? Yes, it can take really pretty pictures, but it's ultimately just recording information. But again, once you recognize that, how can you, from that new point, identify ways in which to make this aesthetic? And I think same thing with sort of film. But this is interesting. I thought this was, I kind of disagreed with this, right? He says that in film, the greatest effects are almost always obtained by acting as little as possible. And the stage actor is able to identify himself with the character of his role. So whereas the film actor is denied this opportunity. So he's saying, like in an actual stage performance, the actor is able to really sort of embody the character that they're playing. Whereas in film, right, it's fundamentally different. And this is true to an extent, right? There's no cut scenes in an actual stage production. For those 2 hours or whatever it is, you are that character. As an actor, you embody that character for that full time. Whereas in film, it's different, right? And I kind of disagree with this because I think, there's all kinds of method acting, and there's people that get really, really into the character. Like, I don't think it's fair to say that actors today aren't, getting into character. But you can see that fundamental difference where it's like somebody who gives that uninterrupted, cohesive performance of a character versus the film actor who is just, one scene cut and, you can instantly just see their face drop back to normal part. They can be like, oh, I'm in the throes of emotion. I'm in the throes, cut. And they just, they're right back at they totally remove themselves from the character. That's something, again, another fundamental difference between the stage play and the piece of film. Again, I don't think it's fair to say that the actor doesn't get into character and that acting is good only insofar as, they act as little as possible and they view actors just as stage props. I think, again, that's what I meant by, I wonder if some of his ideas here are informed by the very early forms of film when it had yet to become what it, is truly capable of. Cool Colt says, I can hardly remember the last time I was at a stage to see acting or at a museum for art. Concerts for music are still common, but other mediums have lost prevalence, partly for convenience. Yeah, I mean, I agree. The only reason I probably wouldn't have gone to that unless my girl had convinced me. But I was actually very, and this is to Walter Benjamin's point, one of the things that really struck me is wow, this is a singular performance, right? It will never be as, whatever this performance, there will never be anything like it, right? And then same thing with a concert. I mean, that's another really good example of this. Back in the day actually a really great example. I'm surprised he doesn't talk about this more because before the reproduction of music, how could you hear music? You would have to go physically, again, the circumstance, the aura, the way in which you consumed music back then, it made for a fundamentally different experience. If I wanted to go, I'd have to physically go to the bard who's playing the lute, or I'd have to go to the band and hear it. But once mechanical reproduction of music became a thing, and now all of a sudden it's universally available, right? There is no I need to go interact with and see the artist and hear them strumming on the guitar, physically see them and see their aura, right? Their thisness in that moment, which I think the modern you still get that with a concert, right? I think that's the same thing as a stage play. The quiddity, the whatness, right? The song, right? The song consists of the G chord and the C chord and singing according to this rhythm, right? There's the sort of the whatness, the abstract version of the song, but in each instantiation of it, there is a thisness. And again, I think a concert is an excellent example of that, right? So, and again, even with the interaction with the audience, some concerts are just such that like the stars align and the energy is super high, and it's just like, even though we've done 50 different tours performing the exact same songs, it could be that, on this night, whatever it was, it's the aura actually, precisely because of the aura, that one might have just been a really special, instance of it. So that's a great example. Cool. Let's see. Oh, okay. And then, so now just breaking this down to the film, right? The ways in which it's different, and especially the fragmented nature of it. Okay, yeah. Film splits the actor's work into a series of mountable episodes. And like I had just said, it is composed, the film, of many separate performances. The presentation of an event on that screen unfolds as a rapid and unified scene in a sequence of separate shootings which may take hours, right? So he's saying when you watch a film, it appears like it's this uninterrupted, unified performance in some sense, right? It's this cohesive piece of art, it's just, you hit play, it's uninterrupted. But the actual work that goes in behind that, totally different. So take, for instance, a jump from the window that can be shot in the studio as a jump from a scaffold. Okay, hold on. Sorry. Let me take that again. Thus, a jump from the window can be shot in the studio as a jump from a scaffold, and the ensuing flight, if need be, can be shot weeks later when outdoor scenes are taken, right? So, like, the image of, like, in a scene where someone jumps out of a window, right? It's not in an actual stage play. All of that would just happen, right? But in film, you could film, right? Somebody jumps off a scaffolding, and it's like, okay, right, cool, cut, right? That's one of the fragmented episodes, and you don't even have to film the direct. What in the film will be the direct logical sequence right after it. You won't have to do that till weeks later. Let's knock it all out once we do the outside filming, right? Then we can connect this scene, we can film for that, and then this scene which belonged to this section of the movie, right? You can film scenes weeks later that belong into 5 different sort of portions of the actual film. So the whole thing is very fragmented, right? It's not this. It's far from a stage play where it's just all an uninterrupted performance. The show must go on. It's one unified thing from start to finish. Fundamentally different than film. Enlighten says, but now lots of bands and artists use samples, and guitar amps are modeling sounds. Vocalists have auto-tune or pitch correct, and drummers have electronic triggers. 99% of concerts have lost a lot of aura too. Yes, exactly. And you know what? Like you mentioned, those things that you just mentioned, right? With like the samples and the guitar amps and auto-tune, pitch correct, or even something like, lip syncing. All of those are in some form, right? This idea of like reproduction, right? It's a lack of authenticity, and something like pitch correct or what's it? Yeah, like I just said, lip singing or something. Those lose its sort of artistic value insofar as they're no longer authentic, right? You're not actually singing at the level you should be. You're using auto-tune. You're using pitch correction. Or you're just not singing altogether. You're lip singing, right? There's a profaneness to it, right? When you're at a concert and you think you're viewing this actual performance, and you find out the person something takes place, and they're fumbling around. They're obviously not singing, but the music continues. You feel sort of cheated. It's like, okay, it's now it's sort of lost its artistic value in very much the same way that he's talking about when a singular piece of art is reproduced, or for instance with those cave paintings, once those gets excavated and take a picture, it's lost its sort of authenticity, and therefore its its aura. 4,000 years ago, a new diabolical counterculture is emerging: calligraphy. Yeah, right. I mean, I think, and obviously there's benefits to this too, right? Like something like the printing press was, foundational and obviously spread knowledge, and even something like art, like as much as we're talking about the importance of like the singularity of an actual original authentic art piece, I mean, how tragic would it be if you could only encounter the art that you could only physically go and see, right? Or even if there was no such thing as museums, right? But especially not being able to look up a piece of art, or I couldn't listen to my favorite album unless I, physically went to the band's performance. Obviously there's benefits to this, but he's just, I think, just from almost a cultural lens, talking about there is a sort of loss that takes place there. Because imagine, I mean, it's two sides of the same coin, right? Like I said, imagine if I could only see the Mona Lisa if I physically went and saw it. That would suck for me. But for the person who is able to go and actually physically see the Mona Lisa, it has that much more degree of uniqueness and specialty, right? It becomes that much more special of a moment when you actually are able to see this, thing that is only in this position in space and time. So, there's trade-offs, and I think he's just, again, sort of giving a cultural commentary on what the sort of changes are that take place. Cool. Okay. I think something important could be pointed out. Photography may be seen as cheating or otherwise lazy, but has emerged as a legitimate, deep art form. Similarly, we may be seeing in music, these electronic components, samples, and straight-up synthesizer music, sines and saw waves can be high art too. Yep, and Bard Sonic, absolutely, definitely upsides. So you're basically saying, and I think that's a good example because something like auto-tune or sampling and stuff has kind of become its own sort of unique thing. Like, I know this is like a big thing in like rap, for instance, like the auto-tune rap. And, whether you like or dislike it, it has, again, like you said, it's kind of evolved into its new thing. Like you said, similarly, we may be seeing in music these electronic components, samples, and, become a high art too. And I'm not saying you have to think... auto-tune rap is a high art, but you can see how like what had originally become sort of like a cheat, right? Vocal pitch adjustment and things like that. You can like really lean into it and make it its own unique thing. I think it's another great example. Electronic can theoretically be seen as having no aura, but some of the most heartfelt stuff I've heard was electronic. Yeah, exactly. And you see how these things are reciprocal and like analogous principles here. It's like what's true of painting and photography, what's true of stage production and film, what's true of the reproduction, the creation of like CDs and recording of music and the concert and all these different things. Yeah, I love where we're going here. I think that's a great example. So, okay, let's see here. Where was I? Oh yeah, so he gives so this is just coming back to what we were talking about with the scaffold scene where it's like you can film a scene where somebody jumps out of a window, falls down, lands somewhere at like, 3 different totally points in time and, totally fragmented. And then he says, there's far more paradoxical cases too, also, again, with this relation of art, acting and art. Let us assume that an actor is supposed to be startled by a knock at the door. If his reaction is not satisfactory, the director can resort to an expedient. When the actor happens to be at the studio again, he has a shot fired behind him. The frightened reaction can be shot now and be cut into the screen version. And so now he's giving an example. It's like, okay, in film, again, this is not something you could do in a stage production, right? Someone's giving a lackluster performance of being frightened. So to instill in them, real fright, you have someone like, shoot a gun right behind them, right? And this is very much this idea of being cheated. I like what you said there, Bard Sonic, Cool Colt, of being cheated. At that point, if you have to make a loud noise to actually, to at that moment make the actor be genuinely scared. But look, now you can use that scene, right? That's not genuine art, right? That's a sort of commodified version of it, right? It's a sort of fake cheating sort of way at getting at what should ultimately be, a real performance, right? But that's not possible in stage acting, right? You couldn't do that on multiple different tours, and it just wouldn't work. Whereas film, you can do something like that. I was about to say, okay, Dingy Clemency C4, we got a new chatter. No, you getting banned. Gang. I said, chat, can we ban Dingley Clemency? Chat, let's ban Dingley Clemency. Hold on, I see block. I know. Wait, hold on. I've done this before. I know how to. Yeah, I need to get more new emojis still too. Hold on. Man, I'm gonna just block. That's as good. That's good enough as banning, right? Yeah. Block. They're blocked. Oh, here I found it. Ban. Okay. Boo. Nice. Okay, sorry for that little departure there, but okay, let's go on. But I mean, again, there's tons of good. You can see now why this is like kind of a classic in literary criticism because this is tons of good stuff here. So, okay, going on here, he says, the feeling of strangeness that overcomes the actor before the camera is basically the same kind as the estrangement felt before one's own image in the mirror. But now the reflected image has become separable, transportable. And where is it transported? Before the public. Never for a moment does the screen actor cease to be conscious of this fact. And again, this detachment, right? Like we were just saying, just as reproducing and printing, mass producing a work of art sort of detaches the actual work of art from its original tradition, so too is the same thing taking place here. We have a detachment of the art from its original tradition. A stage actor has the same sort of strangeness, right? This weird sort of uncanny feeling where you're performing, you're acting, but there's no public, right? It's basically of the same kind as the estrangement felt before one's image in the mirror, but now the reflected image has become separable and transportable, right? Again, there's no more public, there's no audience. In fact, during the shooting, he has as little contact with an audience as in any article made in a factory, right? And again, this is the commodification, where it's like, literally an object that is assembled in a factory has as much sort of contact in term, like analogously here with the actor and the audience, right? There's absolutely no contact at all. They're again completely removed from the tradition in which it was originally supposed to be formed. And here, you know what? I circled my highlight here, so let me see what I have here if it's worth bringing up. It's okay. It is interesting, but we'll come back to that if we have time. But okay, so the film responds to the shriveling of the aura with an artificial buildup of the personality outside of the studio. The cult of the movie star preserves not the unique aura of the person, but the spell of the personality, the phony spell of commodity. So because there is this, again, shriveling up, as he says, of the aura in film, right? There's no public sort of relationship with the performance and the actor. What the film industry tries to do is it responds by building up a cult, right? I think that the word there is very important. A cult of the movie star. Again, giving it sort of like that lore, okay, kind of a silly example, but someone like Keanu Reeves, he has a whole, personality. He has a whole cult following. And again, he has the spell of personality. He has a bunch of lore. He has an aura, essentially. But again, this is all very different than what you would normally expect in like a stage play. This is a sort of contrived, phony spell of commodity. This is almost. I'm not saying that about Keanu specifically or anything. I'm just saying, there are definitely sort of campaigns by like marketing people in Hollywood and film and everything to sort of build up like this image, this persona of the person, and that is sort of like the cheap, commodified version of the aura that we again would normally associate with a stage actor. Again, it's sort of a bastardization, you could say. And again, you don't have to agree with this, but what Walter Benjamin's saying, there's a profaning of like what really ought to be the original aura of the actor, the performance, and the audience. Okay, here I gotta piss. I've been drinking a lot of tea. Let me soothe my voice, and this I think is a good stopping point. So I'm gonna piss. You guys can all just ruminate in the deep insights we have been discussing at Big Nate's Reading Club. But let me take a sip, and then I'm gonna piss real quick. You already know. I'll be right back. What's good, everybody? It's your boy. I'm back. Ruminating in progress. Amazing. Look at that. Amazing. But your boy's back. And let's see, where were we? Let's just jump right back in. So, how does the cameraman compare with the painter? To answer this question, I like this part. I think it's interesting. He gives this analogy with a surgical operation. The surgeon represents the polar opposite of the magician. The magician heals a sick person by the laying on of hands. The surgeon cuts into the patient's body. And so, he's just talking about this original idea of back in the day, and I mean, I won't go just like the Stone Age, sort of prehistoric, before the hyper rationalization and modernization, right? He's talking about the magical, sort of maybe even mystical traditions and stuff like that, right? They performed their healing functions by a laying on of hands. There was a direct, right, in this case, literal contact, a laying on of hands, whereas the surgeon cuts into the patient's body, right? It has the scalpel and the scissors. It has its tools, right? So the magician is personal, right? There's an actual personal interaction in the same sense that like the stage production would interact with an actual audience. Whereas with a doctor, the interaction is sterile, right? There's no direct contact. It's actually through these mechanized tools. And that is very analogous with this idea of film, where there's special effects and there's lighting and there's the camera and there's like this fragmented thing. So he's saying there's this analogous comparison here between something like photography and film and like the painting and the stage production. So let me see. Cool quote says, I feel like if a piece of art of any medium is of a certain caliber, it transcends said medium. So perhaps the discussion of the best art form is irrelevant. Yeah, I think that's true, right? If anything, that is kind of the transcendence, I think, is integral to like, what real art actually is. No matter of what medium. And again, we can have like our preferences and everything, but fundamentally the principle of what's going on there is the same across all of them. But yeah, coming back to, again, I like this the idea of the shaman, the medicine man, right? The magician, as he says, and the surgical, totally sterile, removed, like one step removed distance of the surgeon, of the doctor. The surgeon abstains from facing the patient man to man. Rather, it is through the operation that he penetrates into him, right? There's no laying on of hands. The only way he interacts with the patient is through the means of these tools, these mechanized tools. Magician and surgeon compare to painter and cameraman. The painter maintains in his work a natural distance from reality. The cameraman penetrates deeply into its web. There is a tremendous difference between the pictures they obtain. That of the painter is a total one. That of the cameraman consists of multiple fragments which are assembled under a new law. So again, it's kind of like just what I've been saying. This analogy with like, the painter. The painter has a hands-on sort of experience with the thing that he's actually painting, right? Whereas, I mean, if you take a picture, right, he even said it, all artistic talents devolve into simply an eye looking through the lens, right? So whereas the painter is, say, for the instance, they're making a picture of a landscape or even a portrait of a person. Or the paintings here, they're looking directly at what it is they're painting. Like, there's no in-between. There's no intermediary. It's direct contact. There's the laying on of the hands, as he says. Whereas, again, in taking a photograph, for instance, or in film, you're now looking through a new lens. You're looking through a tool. You're looking through the equivalent of the scalpel and the scissors and all the surgical equipment, right? That's the equivalent of the lens and the camera, right? There's no longer this direct contact. You're looking through something else to achieve, to that is the way in which you make contact with the thing it is in which you are doing your art. Yeah, the magician dichotomy, yeah, super interesting. So let's see. Yep, going on. Okay, so yeah, that's so. Again, also, I think a lot of this is just emphasizing, fleshing out, further developing a lot of the core ideas we've been talking about from the beginning of the essay. But this next part, he talks about the sort of relation in which art has with the masses. So as he says, mechanical reproduction of art changes the reaction of the masses toward art. A painting has always had an excellent chance to be viewed by one person or by a few. The simultaneous contemplation of paintings by a large public is an early symptom of the crisis of painting, occasioned by the appeal of artworks to the masses. So basically, in its original form, painting, was viewed by one person or by a few. And even here, he's talking about museums. So he's not talking about photography and the massive printing press, all that stuff. He's even saying the existence of museums in which it's on display for a bunch of people to at once come and visit it. Even that is a sort of mechanical reproduction, right? He says it's an early symptom of the crisis of painting. And ultimately, it's an appeal of artworks to the masses, which, again, on the one hand, that's good for all the reasons we've talked about. But this is fundamentally different from the original tradition in which it has, right? Originally, paintings were only seen by one or perhaps a few. And then as he's saying, the museum is almost like a sort of a sign, a prototype of mechanical reproduction. Because now it's in a way where it's supposed to be viewed by, thousands of people, right? But again, think about it, actually. In a museum, there's hundreds of paintings. Each of those paintings, when they were originally constructed, right, it was a person in a physical place, in a physical time. Think of all the different contexts and histories and circumstances of each of those hundreds of paintings in a museum, right? A museum, by definition, strips the paintings of all of those hundreds of individual circumstances and removes it, displaces it, and puts it in this totally sort of sterile new way, right? Now it's here purely for display. It's hung up on certain walls, right next to another, sort of almost in like a grid-like fashion. And in so doing, while it does, make available to the masses art, right? Many of us wouldn't be able to experience most forms of art if it weren't for museums, of course, let alone something like the internet. But again, this is a very different relationship to the masses as has been originally established. But in a museum, you have removed each of those paintings from their original tradition, from their original circumstance, and completely placed it in an artificial, commodified sort of setting. Let's see here. Painting simply is in no position to present an object for simultaneous collective experience, as it was possible for architecture at all times, for the epic poem in the past, and for the movie today. Painting was against its nature, confronted directly by the masses in something like the idea of the museum. I really like the pointing out the theme of increasing viewership. Some media now is graded purely on its viewership, YouTube, TV, Exactly. The medium is the message, right? By incorporating this new idea of reproduction and being able to access, especially with something like the internet, being able to be reproduced, hundreds of thousands of times anywhere you can meet any person in whatever circumstance they happen to pull up the YouTube video or the TV video, right? All of, that is now it becomes even a thing where it's fundamentally shifted the thing, because now some media, like you say, is graded purely on its viewership. How many views did a video get, right? Oh, like this video did great. It got 1 million views. It got 100,000 views. That's a whole different metric of what is, a successful piece of art, relative to something like a painting, right? Revive the Renaissance portal. Exactly. I love it. Again, we've just been talking, as he says, painting, it's against the nature of painting. Also, welcome, first time chatter. Welcome. I gotta throw the welcome out there. But, and I mean, it's true, right? And it's hard to get yourself into this perspective, and that's why these essays are cool. But back in the old days, someone does a painting. What realistically happens to it? Like, you might hang it up in your house, right? You might show it to some people, but it was never going to get any kind of widespread recognition. Like, before the advent of museums, why do you paint a painting? It's got to be out of some purely intrinsic, joy of being able to, there's something just intrinsically good about painting that you like, and that's why you do it, right? It was never for the intention of hundreds of thousands of people to see it, before museums existed. But with the advent of the museum, actually, cool cult, it's very related to like what you said. Well, now all of a sudden there's this new incentive. Now some people are painting purely so that they can be featured in so-and-so museum, and they can have the prestige and the accolades of having being exhibited at the Met or something like that. And now with something like YouTube and TV and stuff like that, it's all about, people, whereas, I mean, he even says in another video, right? Like, if you did a film, right? If you made a film and it couldn't be distributed to a lot of people, nobody would make it would cost thousands upon thousands and thousands of dollars to make this thing. And if like a painting only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people were able to see it, nobody would do this, or if they did, it's for a fundamentally different reason. But the fact that there is this widespread reproducibility adds, again, like sort of new incentives, a new relationship with art in general. Now you have people making films. The underlying assumption there, I mean, that's even an interesting question. I wonder how many, if would people still make films if there wasn't the idea that people would watch it? So with something like, I mean, this is something Walter Benjamin talks about specifically, how expensive it is. He even says, like, it's average. I'm not going to pull up the footnote, but like, it's estimated a film costs, millions of dollars to make at that, at that point in time. With something like writing and even something like painting, it's like, it's relatively low barrier, right? I write, for instance. I would write even if nobody were to ever read my writing. Of course, that's eventually a goal, but I would still be writing, and I think that's very true of painting. But film is an interesting case because it costs many millions of dollars to make a film, but no one in their right mind would do that. Even if they really liked film, nobody would do that if it was only being able to be viewed in terms of like how a painting was back then, where you had to like physically pass it from one person to the next, right? So again, it just totally changes the relationship to the masses, and also the incentives, and just the relationship in general. Is a blank canvas good enough? If you think it is, yes, absolutely. So let's see here. Okay, yes. And again, very related to stuff we've been talking, but just, again, going through this. So he's talking about before film, our metropolitan streets, our offices and furnished rooms, our railroad stations, and our factories appeared to have us locked up hopelessly. Then came the film and burst this prison world asunder by the dynamite of the 10th of a second, so that now, in the midst of its far-flung ruins and debris, we calmly and adventurously go traveling. In other words, film has completely opened up a new space entirely. Like before, we were limited to, again, the metropolitan streets, our offices, our furnished rooms, like wherever you could physically go. That's kind of how I'm interpreting it. But something like film completely breaks open our world. It bursts this prison world asunder by the dynamite of a 10th of a second. And he goes on to, and this is applicable in multiple levels. So he says, with the close-up, space expands. With slow motion, movement is extended. The enlargement of a snapshot does not simply render more precise what, in any case, was visible, though unclear. It reveals entirely new structural formations of the subject. And again, I like this example. Slow motion not only presents familiar qualities of movement, but reveals them in entirely unknown ones. So this idea that like film opens up a whole new world in some sense, right? You could have just a scene of me walking, right? Just a scene of me, or even actually yet, imagine I'm running, right? Imagine I'm running in fear even. Being able to look at that with the naked eye, you're not going to be able to pick up on the minutia of, for instance, if you put that scene in slow motion, if you have someone running in fear in slow motion, or even if you do a close-up, you are able to, new worlds open up. You have access to things that are otherwise not accessible by the naked eye, right? All whole new qualities emerge by virtue of like these, special effects, which are otherwise unattainable through the camera. Yes, a different nature opens itself to the camera than opens to the naked eye. The camera introduces us to unconscious optics, as does psychoanalysis to unconscious impulses. So those unconscious optics, those things that might have been sub-perceptual, but we wouldn't have been able to look at it in any real detail, or zooming into a picture, zooming in on a camera, right? All of these, this opens up a new level. It breaks open our world asunder and introduces the unconscious optics, as does psychoanalysis to unconscious impulses. Okay, yeah, so going on here. One of the foremost tasks of art has always been the creation of a demand which could be fully satisfied only later. The history of every art form shows critical epochs in which a certain art form aspires to effects which could be fully obtained only with a changed technical standard, that is to say, a new form. And basically he's saying oftentimes there are these sort of prophetic things. And he talks about how there used to be flip books, right? And you could just flip the page. I don't know if you guys, maybe I'm old, but you'd have like an image, like a bounce. I used to do this with like little sticky note things, like you could, each little frame you could do it. Once you flip through, it gives this illusion of motion. And, he gives a bunch of examples of like things that seem to kind of anticipate the advent of film. And he gives this whole take where he basically says Dadaism, which I've known a little bit about it, but and if anyone has thoughts here, let me know. But Dadaism to me was just like literally the embodiment of just like actual absurd shit. Just like total, it's like, very postmodern. Like if I'm not mistaken, like I learned about it in one class, like there was this exhibit and it's just a bunch of like, you walk in, people tweaking out, and like this dude just like smashes like an aquarium full of water with a hammer, and there's like just, crazy, just like literally absurd. Just like, truly absurd. And again, he says it kind of anticipates film, and he has interesting reasons why. So, for instance, their poems of Dadaism are word salad containing obscenities and every imaginable waste product of language. The same is true of their paintings, on which they mounted buttons and tickets. What they intended and achieved was a relentless destruction of the aura of their creations. The super duper abstract stuff today loses the plot, unnecessary. Yeah, and I think Dadaism gets critiques for this as well. Oh, my battery's almost dead. I got a little bit, and we're kind of wrapping up here, so I think we'll be good. But yeah, again, just like this total deconstruction of what art even is, right? That's the idea of Dadaism, reaching such a height of absurdity that, again, the aura of what a painting or a poem is completely deconstructed. Honestly, I found this part a little less like kind of convincing, but it's still an interesting argument. This idea that Dadaism as a artistic art form anticipated something like film conceptually. He says, the painting invites the spectator to contemplation. Before it, the spectator can abandon himself to his associations. Before the movie frame, he cannot do so. No sooner has his eye grasped a scene than it has already changed. It cannot be arrested. The idea that in a portrait or looking at a painting, you can really lose yourself in, just looking at it and thinking about all these different associations that you personally have, right? You can really contemplate a work of art. Whereas in film, he says, no sooner has your eye grasped a scene than it has already changed. It cannot be arrested. And in fact, there's another quote here. Yeah, a man who concentrates before a work of art is absorbed by it. He enters into this work of art. In contrast, the distracted mass absorbs the work of art. So a man who contemplates a work of art is absorbed by it, right? You are pulled in by the art itself, as opposed to the more lowbrow entertainment sort of, in this case, he's talking about film, which we've kind of hashed that out, right? But in contrast, the distracted mass absorbs the work of art. This is different, right? In one, you are absorbed by the art itself. It captivates you. You're walking by a museum and a painting just captures your attention and you're absorbed by it. Whereas otherwise, if you're just watching a stupid TV show, you're passively watching it, right? You absorb the work of art, in some sense. Once again, quantity has been transmuted into quality. The greatly increased mass of participants has produced a change in the mode of participation. Again, we have a qualitative change to what's actually, the nature of art here. The kind of participation which the movie elicits from the masses, he gives a quote of someone, Duhamel here, who calls the movie a pastime for helots, a diversion for uneducated, wretched, worn-out creatures who are consumed by their worries. I'm like, sheesh, okay, I'm not watching, never mind, I won't watch TV. A spectacle which requires no concentration and presupposes no intelligence, which kindles no light in the heart and awakens no hope other than the ridiculous one of someday becoming a star in Los Angeles. So, this again, I think this might be a symptom of what people thought film was originally. Nobody today would say film is not capable. No one would say film does not presuppose intelligence or requires no concentration. There's tons of films that are deeply moving and require tons of concentration and critical thinking and interpretation. Obviously that's true. But here he's talking about this sort of lowbrow, which I imagine, you know, like with David Foster Wallace and TV, was the original sort of conception of film, right? Kindles in no light in the heart, awakens no hope other than the ridiculous one of someday being a star in Los Angeles. Very, again, lowbrow, not, it's not art. It's not real art in that sense. You know, and then Walter Benjamin said, at bottom, this, again, he was quoting a critic, Duhamel. At bottom, this is the same ancient lament that the masses seek distraction where art demands concentration. And then we get that line I just mentioned. A man who concentrates before a work of art is absorbed by it. He enters the work of art, whereas in contrast, the distracted mass absorbs the work of art. And so just closing out here, we've had a lot of good conversation, but final line essentially, the film makes the cult value recede into the background, not only by putting the public in the position of the critic, but also by the fact that at the movies, this position requires no attention. The public is an examiner, but an absent-minded one, right? So you can just very passively, right? It doesn't have any cult value. Film, according to Walter Benjamin, and it will say in this context, is a commodity, right? Like the cranked out Marvel movies, the cranked out remakes of other movies, right? These aren't deep art necessarily. They're commodities. And in this case, the public is an examiner, but an absent-minded one. And I think we've kind of talked about at length here the ways in which that might not necessarily be true. And there's tons of ways film, at least now as it's really coming to its own as a form of art, is able to do so. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is a work, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. So I think we've got a ton of fantastic ideas here. I do think it is interesting. And of course, there's trade-offs, but just, again, the cultural commentary, there is something fundamentally different that happens for art in the age of mechanical reproduction. With film, with photography, like we talked about with music and all those different art forms, there is a qualitative shift that happens in the quantitative one, right? Once you can produce 100 copies of the Mona Lisa, there is now a fundamentally different approach and understanding of the Mona Lisa, right? Quantity becomes a quality in and of itself. So again, great stuff. Thank you, everyone, for a fantastic conversation. Let's just read this last comment here. There's a line between films produced for their own sake and film produced for mass consumption. Yes, exactly. And I think what Walter Benjamin was talking about was the mass consumption stuff, at least his sort of more negative aspects of it. But yeah, Benjamin is legitness. And again, look at this. This was a singular. Look at the aura of this Twitch stream. You ain't gonna find nothing like it. You ain't gonna find it. There's a hexaity, there's a thisness to the Twitch stream here. And anyways, I'm so glad that because you know what? This video is gonna get millions of views on YouTube, right? And they'll all see it, but they weren't here. They weren't here. So anyway, thank you guys once again for tuning in. Next week, by the way, my battery's about to die. It's at 4%. So if it dies, that's what happened. Next week, I kind of want to take a little break, like a big text every week has been kind of a lot, but so I want to, encoding overloaded. Can you guys see me? You guys can see me still? Encoding overloaded. I don't know what that means. Okay, assuming you guys can see me. Okay, still good. I think next week we should just do like a chill stream. Like we'll go maybe watch some booktube videos or just like otherwise videos that would kind of, spark some discussion. For instance, like Jared Henderson or something like that. But I feel like I need a little bit of a breathe. It's been a tough week or so for me. So let's take one. It's not even a week off. We'll still stream same time next week. But my mouth is delayed. I had to do something. Anyway, sorry. I'm getting distracted. We're just gonna chill. Maybe we could finish that David Foster Wallace interview. Maybe we could just again watch some just like kind of discussion-y sort of videos. I think that'd be good. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Sounds like people are on board. If you have some videos that you want to shoot by, we can check out. We'll do that. But anyway, I look forward to seeing you guys next week. I think, again, fantastic discussion. Thank you for everybody who participated. Good shit. And once again, at ease to the Big Nate gang. Thank you guys so much. I'm clicking the button. Thank you guys so much for watching. And thank you guys so much for watching Big Nate's Reading Club, home of the best reading clubs.